Hello and welcome once again to another episode of The Raw Men. This is episode 17. We're going to be talking today about how Muslims in the media, not just Muslims, but also Islam, and how Muslims and Islam are represented separately or in separate contexts within the media. And I'm talking about Western media, of course, centering on the United States. Our guests tonight is Yasmin Ali, who is a Camp Quest volunteer and also a member of the ex-Muslims of North America. We also have Ali Rizvi, who is a Pakistani-Canadian writer and physician. He writes for the Huffington Post and is working on his first book, The Atheist Muslim. And I'm going to expect you to explain that here momentarily. And then Faisal Said Al-Mutar, who's been on my show before. He is the founder of the Global Secular Humanist Movement and Secular Post writer-blogger for the Huffington Post. He's a columnist for Free Inquiry magazine and is the Middle East community manager at movements.org. Guests, thank you for being on the show tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And before we get started, Mark, do you have any announcements that we need to cover? Mark?
Yeah, thanks for everybody coming. I did want to announce a couple things. One, the new official Ramen podcast shirt is out. It's available. It's black with white letters, very simple, as Aaron would love. And you get it on the Facebook page. There's a link on there. All the people that bought the first edition one, we appreciate that. But we said we weren't going to make that one anymore, so you got that one out of the way. But more importantly, this episode is sponsored by ReasonCon. It'll be the weekend of April 26th in Hickory, North Carolina. It is tickets are available at reasonnc.com. Speakers include Tracy Harris, Phil Ferguson, Beth Presswood, David Smalley, Hina Databoy, and David Fitzgerald. I believe they've added a couple speakers since then, and the Ramen Podcast is one of the sponsors of the conference as well. So go to reasonnc.com and get some tickets. That's all I got, Aaron, and I'm excited.
When is ReasonCon, real quick? When is it?
It is the weekend of April 26th, so very soon. Less than 2 months away. Shannon from Be Secular, my wife, and the president of Be Secular will be there. I will not be there, but it was good last year, and it should be good this year.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, so Faisal, I want to start with you, and I want to ask, what is your the Middle East Community Manager Movements.org? What was that?
Oh well, first thank you for having me. We've done so many shows before, so I feel like I'm with family. Yeah, I mean, I'm the project movements.org. I urge anyone who's watching the show to go to it. Is that it's a project first was started by Google Ideas. You can look at the whole history in Wikipedia, and it's now acquired by an organization called Advancing Human Rights. And what we actually try to do is try to listen to the activists from closed societies. Closed societies include the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, China, you name it. So there is a system created by Freedom House in which you can see the countries in which they are free, partially free, or non-free. So we're focused on the countries that are partially free and non-free, and we help the activists who are living in that region and connect them to experts. And experts can be from policymakers. We have congressmen, people at the State Departments there. We have people from the Parliament of Canada, from Australia, who try to listen to the activists in that region, as well as we have editors, translators. Actually, to announce one thing, which is very much related to secularism, after the death of the Bangladeshi blogger, from my movement, the Global Secular Humanist Movement, and utilizing the Movements platform, we brought a lot of translators who speak Bengali and English, who are going to translate the works of the blogger into English and try to let the world know about his work, as well as try to talk to policymakers to protect freedom of speech in Southeast Asia and the Muslim world in general. So this is technically what I'm generally focused on, is to help people who are trying to create a democratic society, trying to build civil society institutions, and try to make the world a better place in these closed societies. And I'm focused mostly on the Middle East because that's where I come from, and I also have expertise on that subject. And yeah, it's a kind of a of a fun and depressing job at the same time, because I'm dealing with giants like ISIS and Islamic extremists all over, and I have my fair share of death threats left and right. So it's a beautiful job, and it's a scary one at the same time.
Okay, thank you for that. And now,
Sure.
Ali Rizvi, we haven't had you on. I'm sorry?
And cheers, I said, cheers.
Thank you. I'm going to go get one myself in a moment. Ali, I haven't had you on the show before, and I don't know you personally as I do Yasmin, so give me an idea what your background is, if you would, please.
I am basically, I'm Pakistani Canadian. I live here in Toronto. I grew up in several Muslim majority countries. So I was born in Pakistan in a city called Lahore. When I was about 5-6 months old, we moved to Libya in Tripoli, and we lived there for several years. My parents were professors, so they liked moving around a lot. And then I lived in Saudi Arabia for a good 11 or 12 years, then Pakistan for another 11 or 12 years, and then came to Canada, was in the US for a little while, and then came back. So that's basically so I came to North America for the first time when I was in my 20s, and I grew up in a lot of these countries, and that has, long story short, that has a lot to do with why I do what I do today.
And thank you. And once again, regarding long story short, because I know Yasmin's story, and it's a good one, but we're not going to have her tell that story tonight. Give me just a quick summary, Yasmin, on your part, since we're going to be talking about how Muslims are represented in, and we're talking primarily about recent news stories. Give me a bit of your background.
Right. So I used to be a Sunni Muslim until about 5 years ago, and I grew up in a religious family in the U.S. I've grown up mostly in the States. I was born in the Middle East. About 5 years ago, while I was transitioning, deconverting from religion, about that same time, my parents arranged a marriage for me that I had refused. And like Aaron said, it is a long story, but long story short, my family members threatened to kill me. I'm sure many of you are familiar with honor killings, and so I decided to get away from that. I left with a backpack full of clothes and $200 and started over my life. I am a student in Texas. I am working on an engineering degree. I'm involved, very active in the atheist community. I try to help other people, especially other women who are in my situation, and I am very involved in Camp Quest and anything I can get my hands into.
At some point, we expect her to be on stage presenting her story in full detail. I met her just days after all of this fell apart in her life, when her life began anew, and it is a good story. I can't wait for this to be shared with everybody else in a full presentation. Now, getting on into the topic of the evening, recent news stories, and one of the things that I brought up in introducing people to the concept, we had the story about the three students, the humanists that were Muslims, but also following humanitarian concerns and wanted to assist people that were refugees, I guess, of ISIS or ISIL, whichever is the correct word for it. And these people were then gunned down by an atheist over apparently parking issues. And then we have other people that come up in the news recently, like one that I read about yesterday is one of those petitions for somebody that is Mauritian, and he is facing the death penalty for resisting discrimination of his caste and for also having spoken lightly of the Prophet, which is, for somebody in the West to consider either of these a crime is a completely alien concept. And then, of course, Raif Badawi, the man who was sentenced to 1,000 lashes, 50 lashes a week or so, and is now being accused of apostasy, as if that could be considered a crime too. These are the kinds of things, and any other examples that you guys want to come up with, are going to be talking about tonight. Who wants to start off?
Well, I guess I could start with this. I just think that there's, I grew up in this. I think the reason that I speak out about this is because I grew up seeing a lot of this. I was in these countries where you can't really speak. And Raif is a friend of mine, and Raif's family is a friend of mine, as well as, I think Faisal also knows him very well. And The one thing that I told him, the several times I've talked to him, the one thing that I've told him repeatedly is that, he grew up in Saudi Arabia, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. He's an advocate for secularism, so am I. He's a writer and a blogger, and so am I. The only difference is I'm able to say what I want to say. I can come here and I can be on this podcast and I can speak my opinions. And he, on the other hand, is flogged, and he's faced with a death penalty for apostasy. So this is, that difference of just being over there and being over here is so stark that I look at him as a hero, and I think a lot of us do. So that there is a narrative, there's an alternative narrative that is in the Muslim world. There are many people who break away from the majority mainstream Muslim narrative that you hear in the media every day, but you never hear their voices. We don't hear their voices because of obvious reasons. We're seeing with Raif, we saw with Avijit Roy, the Bangladeshi blogger who was hacked to death in Dhaka recently, and we've seen it with a lot of people who live in these countries who feel the same way, who think the same way that a lot of us do, who've been able to managed to come here and been able to have a voice, but they're silenced, and the problem is that unfortunately we're not doing enough to help those voices come out.
Let me ask you about that before we jump into anything else. Regarding the attack in Dhaka, there was a grassroots kind of a process urging the government to do something, right? Is there any hope that there's going to be any kind of justice proceedings? I understand that somebody was arrested, but what do you foresee actually happening as a result of that? Is the government going to pay attention, or is there going to be any kind of a social change based on the grassroots response and protests and demonstration?
Well, one thing I'll draw your attention to is the Raif Badawi video when he was being flogged. It wasn't just the government. There's a crowd of hundreds of people around him. And you see this in the ISIS videos of recently, the gay men who were thrown off the rooftops. There are hundreds of people there, sort of just watching, expressionless, and it's almost like they rushed. There were kids rushing to see Raif's flogging, and they were running excitedly. They were happy about it. So back in 2013, when we were talking about Bangladeshi bloggers, there was a procession that came out, of close to 500,000 people came on the street. They were talking about 4 atheist bloggers, and they were demanding their execution. So generally, I think that the people over there, it's not just the governments that oppress the people, and it's not like a lot of the people in the population there is rooting for these dissidents. They also consider them criminals, and unfortunately, many of them actually support their punishments. If you look at polls, the Pew poll done in 2013 in a lot of countries like Egypt and Pakistan, with some of the largest Muslim populations in the world, they favor the death penalty for apostasy. There are large numbers of them, and even in countries, in Muslim majority countries where it's a minority, it's about 20-30% of them will say they favor the death penalty for apostasy. So this is not just, if the government doesn't do something about it, I don't think a lot of people over there, unfortunately, will care much. So it's an unfortunate situation.
To add more to what my friend Ali said, is that in Saudi Arabia, it's kind of, through my work, it's kind of one of the most difficult countries we are dealing with. Is for the reasons that Ali mentioned, is that when it comes to Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, who recently died, is by definition a moderate compared the guy who said that women should not be allowed to drive and things of that sort. It's by comparison a moderate to the average population in Saudi Arabia, which is kind of very, if you think about it more deeply, it's kind of very scary thought, is that those that we probably think of as extremists are actually moderates, and they have made a deal, and that's since the creation of Saudi Arabia, is that there is a deal made between the Wahhabi establishment and the hardliners within that country and the royal family of Saudi Arabia, which established monarchy, is that there is some sort of separation between the hardliners and the royal family, to the way that the royal family is allowed to large extent do whatever they want, but the hardliners are they follow, like, they pretty much built up the institutions for al-amr bil ma'ruf or an-nahy anil munkar, what's called, like, the it's about Islamic Sharia law. I don't know the English translation, but it's about establishing the rule of Islam and so on. So so I mean, and when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia, is that it's a country with a large resources, and these hardliners have a lot of wealth that they were able to spread their ideology, mostly in countries like Pakistan and even Bangladesh and some parts of India, and as well as around the region. And they created what is called ISIS and Al Qaeda and so on. So it's kind of a very, somebody thinks deeply about it. It's kind of a very scary thought to think that the Wahhabi hardliners, they were able to some extent to succeed in spreading their ideology all around, to the way that their ideology to a large extent became some sort of mainstream, or I wouldn't call it mainstream, but accepted narrative of Islamic theology within a large part of the Muslim world. And so look at the statistics from. I mean, obviously there are a lot of geopolitical factors that play into why some countries have lower percentages than others. Like if you look at the Pew research that Ali talked about, you look at the countries, which I call them the Stan countries, except Pakistan, but like countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, or at least the Central Asian countries, they kind of have a lower percentage of people who favor death for apostasy. And the main reason is pretty much understandable within world history, is that these were communist countries. They were part of the Soviet Union, and atheism is a kind of a main structure of communism. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not a fan of communism, but it's been a main structure of communism, and these countries were prior communist nations. So when the Soviet Union fell down, they still maintained some respect for atheists, to the way that even though they have religious Muslim leaders, but they don't think that killing apostates or killing atheists in that regard is permissible. But if you're going to look at countries like Yemen or Iran or Pakistan or Egypt, which is supposedly the poster child for Islamic moderation in the Arab world, you will see that the percentages of people who favor death penalties is roughly about 60 to 70%. That means that, imagine living in a country in which 3 out of 4 people want to kill you for being an atheist, and that is kind of so it's really scary world we live in right now. And speaking about helping dissidents, I mean, this is really my full-time job, and it's kind of very difficult because, first of all, it's hard to find these dissidents. That's number one. It's really hard to find who are these dissidents, and even the word dissident is kind of a very vague term, because sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your enemy. And if you look at people, for example, who oppose the Islamic Republic of Iran, and you think that, oh, they oppose the Islamic Republic of Iran, they must be the good guys. They
ISIS.
ISIS, exactly. I've met with people who have similar beliefs as ISIS, and I also have met people who believe in the superiority of the Persian race. So like they were kind of a neo-Nazi style Persian mixed with Iranian Kormasabzi, and they were able, and these people are also opposition. They're also dissidents by the true definition of dissident. They're also dissidents, but at the same time they oppose the Islamic Republic for completely wrong reasons. So it's kind of it's very important to stay focused on people like our friend Raif Badawi and others, because they are, in my definition, they're the true heroes. They're the people who hold values that if it's going to be mainstream in these societies, it's really going to change these societies to become a better place.
Yeah, now that's something I want to make a comment about changing societies, and this is about the only thing that I could probably speak to, since we're talking about cultures that are alien to my own experience. The correlation that I see from my experience is that my family were very old West kind of people, very redneck, and they would talk about how they used to take children to public hangings. You know, that this is something that as you said, the children waiting to go see Badawi flogged and all of this. Well, it used to be a family outing to see people hanged, which is an act of barbarism now, but was commonplace once upon a time. Obama recently was criticized by the Christian community simply for pointing out that Christianity was in a similar place at one point to what Islam is now, and that it's being the older religion, that it's gone through this stage already, and for historic reasons isn't there now, and maybe the violence is that there's hatred in Christianity, there's violence in Christianity, but that it's socially repressed, where we're not seeing that kind of repression in Islamic countries right now. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, sorry, who was that? Well, Faisal, you want to take this, or?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. Or let Yasmin take the lead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you had mentioned that if the poll about most Muslims agree to death to apostasy, I wonder if we did the same and asked Christians what the percentage would be. And I also want you to consider that those Muslims are also victims, and they're sheep. And so I don't think those people who took this poll agreed to death to apostasy. I think there's more to that.
Well, I mean, there is something to be added to the poll, is that you look at the research done by North Carolina Chapel Hill, which is done on the elections that happen in the democratic societies within the Muslim world. So we're not talking about dictatorships. We're not going to talk about Saudi Arabia and so on. But if you really can see that it is a very, the penalty for apostasy, whether it has legitimacy within Islam or not, within the Quran or Hadith, and I think it is. But even if it does not, it is a very well established view within the Sunni and Shia school of thought. It has been agreed upon by even the Azhar, which is the main institution in the Islamic theology in Egypt. It agreed upon by imams, and even within the Shia is kind of they everybody say something else, but within the Sunni, which makes up the majority of the Muslim world, I mean, it's a very well established point of view that people who leave Islam should be killed. So whether the question about is whether these people who said yes, that is a very important question, is that whether the people who said yes are willing to take action to kill those, and that is an open-ended debate.
Well,
but
right,
at the same time,
that's a different situation. I'm saying I don't think those people are willing to act on it. I mean, I can tell you, when I was a Muslim, I justified Muhammad marrying a 6-year-old and consummating the marriage at 9, whatever the numbers were. Point is, it's a child. I tried justifying that and justifying that gay people should be punished, and that, death to those who stop believing. I was that person. That's because it was brainwashed. I mean, it was drilled into me. And when you believe that God exists and you're trying to make this being happy, you're going to try to say whatever he agrees with. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that is what we're seeing in these poll results too. I mean, these aren't people that will all of these people who responded, will they take the knife to an apostate's neck? Probably not. A lot of them probably won't. But the fact that they will come out in support of it, the fact that they will come and rally for it, like the 500,000 people who came out in Bangladesh in 2013 demanding the deaths of like the 4 atheist bloggers, that certainly doesn't help the case. It just shows that there's a lot of support. I mean, it all acts. They all sort of like act in conjunction.
They're all afraid of terrorists too. I mean, terrorists are not just specifically attacking non-Muslims.
Oh, they're mostly attacking
everyone.
Muslims. Yeah, they are.
Right,
and that's the thing.
So,
if you look at, there is a way to measure this. I think. I mean, if you look at Iraq, who is a considerably a very democratic society after the U.S. invasion. The elections were supervised by the United Nations, by many established organizations in the United States Department, and so on. When people believe that the penalty for apostasy should be killed, the majority of people voted for parties that think that the penalty for apostasy should be killed. If you look at Egypt, which is when they actually established a democratic society, what did the majority of the people voted to? The Muslim Brotherhood, who believe in Islam is the solution. That is their motto.
Yeah.
So even if the person is not willing to do the killing himself, when he's gonna be in a position in voting between a party that advocates for killing apostates and the other party which does not, the likelihood, I'm not going to give a very definitive answer because this research are kind of open debate, but the likelihood they're going to vote for a party that kills apostates.
Mm-hmm.
So,
there's always this conversation about, you know, whether it's bigoted to talk about Muslims that way, and we're talking about Pew poll results. I mean, I want to make it clear that this is not what all Muslims think, but unfortunately, there's more support for it, you know, than we think. And I think that a lot of times when we say, like, you know, when Reza Aslan, for instance, you know, when he says that that the book has no meaning and that people bring their own meaning to the book and so on, I think that that is actually even more bigoted in a way because it's denying the agencies, negating the agency of people over there. He's basically saying the book has no influence, so the disproportionately high number of violent people or misogynistic people in that part of the world it's somehow in their DNA. It's inherent in those people, and that to me is a much more bigoted position to take, rather than, you know, what Yasmin's saying, that there's an ideology that's been drummed into their heads as something that they've been indoctrinated with, and even sort of people with the kind of insight and introspection that you have, Yasmin. I mean, you were able to eventually come out of it, but at one point, you know, you also felt a lot of those things. And I remember growing up, I saw my own relatives and friends, and, you know, like in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, when I was growing up in these countries, you know, I mean, there's different ways to glean what people's opinions about these things are. You know, the poll results definitely are useful. I mean, they're not perfect, but they're definitely useful. They're one of the best things that we have. At the same time, lived experience, you know, having lived there and knowing, even with close family and friends, that there are certain things I couldn't say because there was this, you know, one crazy cousin or one guy at school or some teacher who could just snap at any moment. I mean, these are very sort of real lived things that I saw.
That's exactly what I was just going to ask. I mean, is the culture such as, like in the U.S., especially, we'll use gay rights, for example. There's people that will say that they're against gay marriage because maybe they don't want people to think they're gay, something as strange as that, or I don't want to be seen as supporting gays because I don't want somebody in my family to think that I do. I mean, is there that's what I was just going to ask. I mean, it seems like that's probably something that happens too, where people that aren't obviously in favor of death to apostates, but they don't want to say that because they don't want to be seen as supporting them or harboring them or whatever.
There's this sort of crossroads that I think a lot of atheists or secularists from Muslim backgrounds are at, and that's a crossroads between it's at ideology versus identity. So, you know, a lot of us, you know, and the way that I like to explain this, I like to make the distinction between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. So, reasonably, like, you know, you could say I'm Islamophobic. I mean, I do not want to be in Saudi Arabia, the country where I grew up, at this point with everything that I've written. I don't want to be in that position. So I have a reason to be scared of, to have a fear of Islamic doctrine and so on. But at the same time, you know, I'm also a Pakistani. I also have a Muslim name. I have Muslim family and friends who are very dear to me, and they're wonderful, peace-loving people, just like anybody else. So I also share that sort of being on the receiving end of the anti-Muslim prejudice as well. So there is this sort of, and that's one of the reasons I titled my book "The Atheist Muslim," is because identity is a very strong part of, I mean, with religious people everywhere. But one of the reasons that, and we see this with the ex-Muslim experience, is that a lot of ex-Muslims, you know, when they leave the religion, they often find themselves with a fragmented sense of identity. Everything that's sort of new. They're not just changing their mind. It's not just that they've changed their mind. They've lost their families. They've been disowned. You know, they've lost their culture. They can't go to the neighborhoods they grew up in. So they lose a lot, and that results in a lot of depression, a lot of struggle for, you know, a lot of them. And so you understand that, you know, so you have to understand the way that identity plays into this sort of religious belief and how they're interconnected. And that's also why sometimes when you criticize Islam, you know, a lot of these people, they take it personally. A lot of the Muslims, they take it personally because they look at it as an attack on their identity. Now, they're wrong about that. I mean, their identity is not tied in with their beliefs. And when you explain to them, in my experience, when you try and explain this this dichotomy to them, they're usually very receptive, and they understand, and they can actually see it. But the way that it's been drummed into us, as we were raised, like there is that sort of the ideology identity hybrid, and when you break that apart, as a lot of us have done, then you're at a crossroads, and you find yourself sort of a little bit you're kind of in the middle of these two conversations that are happening, and you don't know exactly what to relate to. So
there was another reason that I wanted to hold this show, was to address the bigotry also on this end, where you talk about, the anti-Islamic bigotry that you're getting, living in North America, that you're getting from other North American citizens. I came from an extremely bigoted background where people didn't even think about the kind of knee-jerk reactions of hateful commentary that they would say, much like Pavlovian dogs. Anytime it was brought up, anything going on in the Middle East, I would commonly hear something like, we ought to nuke the whole son of a bitch in place, turn it into a glass bowl. This is the kind of stuff that I have relatives that would talk like this. And so there's not any thought to the idea that there are people involved. And I don't think it was until the event in Iran where there was this the huge protest, and the one woman was shot in the chest, and it got out on YouTube. That a lot of Americans didn't see Iranians as anything other than, them evil sort of people until they saw that one world and were able to empathize with this one person. And so I just want people to be aware that we are dealing with people first, and that the ideology is separate. And what I'm seeing in the media is that we're seeing Muslims dealt with one way and Islam dealt with another, and I'm kind of for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think people fear what they don't know. I've put up with a lot of that discrimination growing up. I mean, I still do, but now, since I don't, as a Muslim woman, I stood out wearing the scarf. Obviously, right off the bat, you'll know I'm a Muslim. Now, I can pass as Hispanic, no problem. People just assume I don't speak English very well. I think, especially after 9/11, being treated differently, I've had people throw things at me, call me Osama bin Laden's daughter. And I think it's, like we're talking about now, the media, how it portrays Muslims. But on the other hand, I've been in the Middle East, and the same thing happens there. They had this idea of how Americans are like, they don't care about anyone else but themselves. They're very materialistic, and all these different ideas. So I've gotten the interesting perspective of getting discriminated, being the receiving end of racism, and then hearing it from the minority in the Middle East and what they think of Americans and how, they see all of this.
Actually, I mean, speaking of racism, I would say, I've lived most of my life in the Middle East. I mean, I grew up over there. I lived there until I became 20, and I would say, like, since I came to North America, I received more racism from people of my own race than people from the other race. I mean, I'm going to be honest about this. I have been called acting white, American son of a bitch, all types of racist stuff about from people who are quote-unquote Arabs and Iraqis. I've been called so many times that I'm no longer Iraqi anymore because I'm an atheist. I've told so many times that I'm not an Arab anymore because I'm an atheist. I was told so many times that because I wear a jacket that I'm acting white and I'm trying to be a puppet for white people, from people who are quote-unquote people of color, who are like Indians and Pakistanis and so on. So, I mean, racism is kind of a double-edged sword. Is that people may mostly think of macro racism, which generally happens between white people, bunch of rednecks in small towns in the middle of nowhere, versus people of color. But they generally ignore there is a lot of racism actually happen in the Arab world. For the Americans, they think that we're all the same. But that is not exactly the case. Like, when I used to live in Lebanon, I lived 1.5 years in Lebanon, and they treat Iraqis like crap. Like, the moment that they know that you're Iraqi, sometimes they spit on you, sometimes they beat you, sometimes they treat you like a third-class citizen, thinking and most people when people here come to America, they think that brown people are a minority, but in fact, in the Middle East, brown people are a majority. So there's a huge difference, and brown people, quote unquote, as they call them here in America, are actually very different identities. I mean, in the Middle East, may look like the same thing if you go look at it from Google Maps, but if you are inside the Middle East, and if you look at how Arabs treat each other, and how Arabs treat, for example, Pakistani workers in Dubai, in Doha,
Saudi Arabia,
in Saudi Arabia, and so on, they treat them not only as second-class citizens, but probably third-class citizens. And it's really, and when it comes to the issue of identity versus ideology, I mean, I'm kind of one of the people who did not really, I would say, struggled with this thing, because I grew up in a very progressive family. I've never really thought of myself as a Muslim at all, even though I practice a bit for about 45 minutes. But generally speaking, I've never really thought, and I think that the issue of identity is that because mostly it happens within extremists or fundamentalist or conservative upbringing, is that in which the identity of religion becomes tied into the identity of the person. Like if you're going to look at, the difference is that why Muslims generally think that when you're going to attack or going to criticize religion, they directly take it as an attack on the person, is because there are more conservative Muslims than conservative Christians. I mean, in the 21st century. I mean, if you roll the clock, if we have space travel right now, and you go back 50 years ago, what's called time travel? Sorry, 500 years ago into the Christian world, and you see that they used to treat people as what now ISIS treats people. But the difference is that there are so now if you're going to criticize Christianity, many Christians, and I am surrounded by Christians 99% of the time, they don't really see it as an attack on their person, because the reformation that happened within Christianity, the modernization that happened within Christianity separated the identity with religion, and that is not the same that is going on in Islam.
I think I have a theory for that, like why Muslims tend to be more extremists in their beliefs. Like I said, if we go back to that poll, if we did the same thing with Christians, we'd probably get a little bit of smaller number. I mean, I still find it hard to believe 1 billion Muslims, 60%, 70, whatever, believe apostasy, death to apostasy. You also have to keep in mind that the way the religion works, praying 5 times a day and the fasting of 30 days, and saying all these various things. When you walk into the bathroom, you have to say anything. When you get out of the bathroom, all these like various rituals. That is, when you repeat those things, you start to believe it. It's ingrained in you. You're a brainwashed robot. I don't know how else to put it, but I mean, it's ingrained in you. And it took, and Ali mentioned this. I mean, it's when you deconvert, it's a physical thing. You're removing the God factor. You're removing all these things you used to believe. So what do I believe now? It makes you dizzy thinking about what your opinions are, and that's what what Islam does. Like it slams you with all these things you have to do, and that's all you're a servant of God. Islam means submission to peace, through God. Muslim, whatever. I mean, I know it's ironic, obviously, but it's all about serving God, and the prayer 5 times a day and all these rituals go along with that.
Mm-hmm. I also think that there is a distinction between and I've noticed this because I've lived, I guess, about like over a decade here in North America, and also in Muslim majority countries, and the way that people see Islam in both places is very different. I mean, I do understand, like, the people who've been born and raised in North America, how they are in, like, you were saying that it was really tough to imagine for people over here how people can believe those kinds of things there. I've noticed that with a lot of the sort of the Muslim community here, that even the conservative ones that are very observant, with all the rituals and everything that you're talking about, they find it very hard to believe how so many people over there can hold these beliefs. And it's a very different thing when you have Muslims in Muslim majority countries. The dynamic there, the way that Islam is practiced, and the kind of things that people conform to, the values and the ideology.
I mean, you'll be preaching to the choir. You're all
it's and everybody. And whereas if you look at India, which has the second or third largest Muslim population in the world, and India is also a minority. The Muslims in India are also a minority. It's only about 13% of the population, but it's still the second largest Muslim population in the world. And over there, you don't see a lot of this sort of extremism and jihadism. You don't see a lot of the international terrorists. And of course, they have local things, pockets of violence here and there, but you don't see it to nearly the scale that you see it in Muslim majority countries. So it is very different. I mean, you have it is 1.6 billion people. It's obviously not a monolith. There's many people who are actually active jihadists. There's and sort of the silent jihadists who kind of agree with it but won't act on it. Then there's Islamists who believe in political Islam. Then there are sort of moderate Muslims. And when we say moderate Muslims, a lot of moderate Muslims are actually very, very conservative. They're extremely conservative. And there's other moderate Muslims who are very liberal. So there's a wide variety of people, and it really depends on where you are.
I'd like to talk about the Islamist word. If I understand this correctly, that means the same thing as an Islamic dominionist. Is that correct? When we have Christian dominionists, and their goal is to have Christianity rule the entire world, and is that not what an Islamist is also?
That's basically what it is. It's a politicization of the ideology where Islamists are generally people who want to impose that ideology, the Islamist ideology, on everybody else. Like that, they generally believe that there's a political motive there.
Muslims, but everyone.
But everyone, yeah.
Yeah.
And I understand that in places where Sharia law is implemented and is fully a part of is enforced by the state, that you don't have the support, or that you have a bit of a deterioration of Islam. Whereas in Western countries, you have people that are not under Sharia law that view Islam very differently. That this is the reason why Islam is growing faster in the West than it is in its own locations. Is that a reasonable is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. I wouldn't. It depends on how you define deterioration, but I think that people here, most of the Muslims here that I've met in Canada and the U.S. they've integrated into the culture. I think that generally Muslims, when they are in secular pluralistic societies, they're able to practice their religion very freely, and at the same time they tend not to take the Islamist approach. They tend to behave more like the Christians and the Jews and everybody else who's here. So I've especially in the U.S. In Europe, it's a different story. As we've seen, but I think in the U.S. and in Canada, I've kind of seen Muslims, the Muslim community here, which is also a minority. It's only, I think, 0.0056%. I mean, it's just only a few million of the entire Muslim world.
Is that the reason why it's a different story? Because the population is so much higher? Because we've seen, and I don't know if this is propaganda or not, and I want to be careful that this is, that I'm not influenced that way. But that the higher the population of a Islamic group, then the more likely you're going to have, this rate of crime or this rate of response, or how they're going to try to implement their legal system and so forth. But when they're beneath 10% or so, well, then they're just going to be a religion of peace, and that's the only way they're going to present themselves. This is the kind of videos that I've seen, and I'm not speaking from education, understand. That's why I have you people on to explain these things to me.
No, you're not. Just kidding. No, I mean, if you look at histories of some countries in the Middle East, I mean, look at, for example, Tehran, 40 years ago. Tehran used to be the central place of fashion and probably technology and human rights. Comparatively much better than many places of the Middle East. If you look at Tehran right now, it's a kind of a very different story. It's not that the Iranians 40 years ago used to be aliens, and the Iranians today are different. They are the same people, but there is this political theory that says is that the majority of the people, if you look at many of the countries, is that there are like 10% who actually believe. So they say 10% who are extremists, 10% who are liberals. I'm not being very definitive in my description, but I'm explaining the theory. And there is 80%, and the 80% are called the hypocrites. the 80% generally follow who is in the leadership. So like you have 10% who are Muslim extremists, 10% who are liberal Muslims. I'm not being definitive, as I said. But the 80% you can see, the ones in the middle, are the ones who are going to follow who is in power. So when Iran, right before 40 years ago, used to have a secular leadership in a Muslim-dominated country, they generally followed the constitution that is, the majority of the people follow the constitution that allows freedoms and so on. When the leader of this country became an Islamist, like Ayatollah Khomeini, the majority of the people, due to continuous propaganda by the regime and so on, they moved into that section because the majority of people just want to live their lives. But there is there is a percentage, a significant percentage in the Muslim world that actually they believe what they say they believe, and that is a problem. Is that we think that the extremists, that those who are actually ISIS-like and so on, are just bunch of 0.001%, and that goes against all the facts. That goes against all what's being studied. Is that the percentage of people who are extremists in the Muslim world make up a significant number, and when these people are in power, they can change everything through continuous. Like now, look at, for example, if I continuously look at the videos of ISIS and what they do with the propaganda of children, they're running schools in the province of Mosul and Tikrit and Anbar, and you will see that all the children that they can raise in these schools right now, in the Islamic State schools, all of them are eventually going to be ISIS leaders, okay? Because the leaders of these of these provinces are ISIS. But if you're going to have leaders of these provinces that are secular dictatorships like Saddam Hussein, you wouldn't have produced ISIS. You would have produced more dictatorships or dictatorship mentality. So it's really about who is in the leadership.
And can I add something to that, Faisal? I mean, one thing that I thought of here is the cynicism that a lot of the people in the Muslim world have towards secularism is also something I find really interesting, because if you look at their association with secularism, you know, when Faisal mentioned the leaders in Iran, when Iran was secular, the Shah was there, and the Shah was basically a dictator. Saddam Hussein was a dictator, and he ran a fairly secular country. A lot of the dictatorships, the oppressive dictatorships in the Muslim world, have been associated with secularism. Their last, you know, when they think of secularism, they think of Kemal Atatürk, you know, the guy in Turkey who basically put the nail in the coffin of the Ottoman Empire, the last great Islamic caliphate, and imposed secularism on everybody. So many of these, the kind of association they have with secularism is not the same kind of association that we have with secularism over here. And for them, it's also related to oppression. It's something that was forced into them by these sort of brutal dictators and so on. So yeah, that also makes them a very sort of cynical and not receptive to it. And the other thing is, like, these dictators, when they were entrenched there for decades, the only organized opposition that actually came up against these dictators was the Islamist groups. Yes. You know, they found that easy because like in Saudi Arabia when I was growing up, you couldn't criticize the government, you couldn't criticize any of the economic, political, or any of the social issues you had. You could not give them a voice. The only place where you had relative freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia was the khutbah, the sermon at the mosque on Friday, right? So all of their political, social, economic issues, their concerns, all kind of got channeled into they got wrapped up in Allahu Akbar and these sermons and sort of came out to the mosque. So Islam really became a sort of opposition to the oppression that they were feeling. Islamism did. So there's a lot of history there. It's very complicated. It has to do with, that also, like, when it comes to the theological aspect, it's the fact that, most Muslims, unlike most Christians and Jews, actually believe the Quran to be the literal, infallible word of God. That also creates a lot of problems because that's a Western definition of fundamentalism. If someone believes that the Bible is the literal word of God, then they become a fundamentalist. And I think that's like 30% of the United States population. Whereas over 90% of Muslims, even progressive ones, it's a requirement of their faith to believe that it's a literal word of God. So, there's so many different aspects that come into it that kind of make people over there so resistant to secularism and pluralism that we probably can't cover it in this one podcast. But It's a great conversation to get started.
Yeah, much the same thing going on in the United States with Christians and their view of communism. Also, communism was always attached to atheism, so everybody thinks that once they realize that I'm atheist, they think I must be communist. We're at the least socialist, and they don't really know the difference between communism and socialism because they're all about prejudicial thinking, and they're not interested in actually understanding what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
They want to make broad brush judgments against whole swaths of people, and I want to argue against that. I want people to think and analyze their situation and not to try to to do the us and them kind of thinking. I want to be able to criticize Islam the same way that I criticize Christianity. And we have the same thing going on with Christians, where we have Christian dominionists who are guilty of just as many wrongs as a lot of the Islamists are doing. We got somebody trying to pass a law in California right now that homosexuals should be shot in the head until dead. They want to make that a law. How can you be so inert? How can anyone be so blind, so ignorant, so prejudiced as to think that you might be able to pass that at the state level as a law? And then that same person is going to criticize the barbarism of Sunni? Really? There's huge hypocrisy there.
There is. I mean, it's Leviticus 20:13. It's right there in the Old Testament. It's like two men who lie with each other as they would lie with a woman should be stoned to death. It's all in there. It's a law of God. So that's one of the problems. Whenever you take things like gay bashing or misogyny or slavery and take all those things, and if you have views like that, and if you want to make them respectable, put them in a holy book, throw them in the Quran, throw them in the Bible, and suddenly you're immune. It's so I mean that's an age-old problem, and that's
well now you're implying that people wrote those holy books. I mean, they're both of those books, the Quran and the Bible, they're both the incontrovertible word of God, right?
Oh no, that's exactly what I'm saying. Exactly. People, if you just quote your holy book and you say, okay, yeah, I believe that gay people should be killed, and you're like, wait, you can't say that. That's you're a homophobe. You're an asshole. You're a cruel person. And then you're like, well, it says it here right in the Bible, and everyone backs off. Like, oh, okay.
But that's my point. I mean, when you talk about Christianity, you can point out all kinds of things that are in the Bible that, I mean, what the Bible condones or does exactly the same thing as Sharia does in many cases, as the most hardline Islamists, because it does say that homosexuals should be killed, and it gives a lot of these other barbaric kind of laws that Christians in general aren't even aware of and wouldn't acknowledge and come up with excuses for why that doesn't really apply to them, right? I mean, they'll argue that it's okay to eat shellfish because this rule out of Leviticus doesn't apply to us anymore because Jesus made a new covenant, but this rule against the homosexuals also from Leviticus does apply. Why? Why is it so arbitrarily divided? So the problem that I have with criticizing Islam and criticizing the religious belief is because, much like Christianity, I know how many things about Christianity the Christians actually ignore. I don't know for Muslims how much of their religion they actually ignore on a regular basis.
The answer is 42.
Well, I think Muslims read the Quran like growing up, I read the Quran front to back, English to Arabic. I think Muslims tend to be more aware of what their holy books say than Christians. And I've tried to read the Bible. It's more difficult too than the Quran. One, the Bible has a lot more, and the Bible also has a lot of interesting and disturbing things. I mean, not that the Quran doesn't, but it's less, I think, gory. What would you guys think? It's less.
Well, I think the Old Testament.
It's very repetitive too. There's like one verse repeated 5 times. Most of the verses are like that in the Quran. Most things are repeated more than one time.
And also beautiful language. I mean, I don't really want to brag about being an Arab, but Arabic is very beautiful language. I mean, like the Quran, in my opinion, even though I've never believed in it in any sort of form, but when I look at the Quran, I really see beautiful poetry. I mean, yes, most of it has a lot of rules and stuff, but if you, it's really beautiful language. I mean, but while the Bible it's mostly translated version, it's really not exciting. It's really like boring as hell.
I've
Well,
always found it interesting that, like, in places where, like, the largest Muslim populations are in non-Arabic speaking countries like Indonesia, India, Pakistan,
China.
Bangladesh. Like these places have huge Muslim populations, and they tend to be a little bit. They don't really know a lot of what's in the Quran. They tend to be a little bit more, at least like at large, the people tend to be a little bit more sort of moderate, if you want to use that term. Whereas I think in some of the Arab countries where people actually know and they understand it, and even not all of them know it, but on a relative scale, there tends to be more conservatism and the more literalness.
That I know that there's. Sorry, go on, Lauren.
I was going to say we've only got 5 minutes left of the show. We were supposed to be talking about how Muslims are represented in the media. So if everybody could just focus your comments to that point in the last 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Yasmin, go ahead. You're saying something.
No, after you.
No, you go ahead. Yasmin, you go ahead.
I've known it since a kid. You know, Fox News, for example. I knew right away as a kid that it, you know, portrayed brown people, non-Christians, in a different way, and they only showed the, I guess, the predators and not the victims. You know, they're showing all the bad sides. This is what the media does. It shows, look at all the bad things that are happening to these people in this religion, and not showing, here are all the victims, and here are all the good people, and here are all the awesome things that they're doing. That's what's happening. I mean, that's the basic thing in media.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Ali?
I think that there is one thing that I think a lot of Western liberals tend to do is what I've seen in the media is there's a lot of, you know, what we call the racism of lowered expectations. You know, we were talking about different kinds of Faisal talked about different kinds of racism, and I think that, you know, what I see is that if you have a white person who dresses his wife up in a burqa and, you know, paraded her around the streets, then everyone would say, you know, he's just a terrible human being. Whereas if I did the same thing, it's okay, it's just respect for my culture. And I think that that's the mistake that a lot of Western liberals make. And that's a narrative we see in the media a lot of times, the people who sort of represent or claim to represent Muslims, and they say Muslims are not like this, all Muslims aren't like this, but then they speak for all Muslims themselves. So I think that voices, dissident voices, reformist voices, need to be shared more. And I've been seeing a lot more of Majid Awaz on TV. I've been seeing more of Ayan Hirsi Ali and some of these alternative voices. Whether you agree with them or not, they need to be out there.
Hashtag not all Muslims.
Yeah.
I would like to see more diversity of, you know, from within the Muslim and ex-Muslim world. I would like to see more general disagreements, you know, to understand just that nobody speaks for everybody. If Americans at least could understand that much, that would be happy.
I mean, even as a non-Muslim, seeing it happen where someone sees a woman in a scarf, like, it triggers me. It makes me angry because I guess I was formerly a Muslim too. But sorry, Faisal, go. No,
you go ahead. No, sorry.
I actually lost my train of thought.
Okay. I mean, Yale, back to the Western liberals, white Western liberals, Yale Undergraduate Association said that Ayan Hirsi Ali doesn't represent the ex-Muslim experience. And I asked them the questions, what the fuck you mean by that? Because there is not such a thing as the ex-Muslim experience. I mean, yes, and even the Muslim experience. I mean, for example, I grew up in Iraq. I was almost targeted by Al-Qaeda. Most ex-Muslims don't know even what Al-Qaeda is, okay? And there are also, most Muslims probably know what Al-Qaeda is. There's a huge diversity of thought that I can definitely not speak for all people of Iraq. I can definitely not speak for all people who are ex-Muslims. There are probably common things here and there, but in general, that Muslims and non-Muslims should be looked at as a spectrum, in my opinion. And what's happening is that within the right-wing media, we're mostly viewed as the enemy, and within the left-wing media, we're mostly viewed as the victim. And these two main segments is that the left-wing media always try to shift in or try to feed in what is called the victimhood complex. That is all the white people fault, is the brown people are just a bunch of victims and they're all innocent and they're all lovely. And then you got, on the other hand, you got this far right wingers who are like, oh, these people of color, they are bad and they are terrible and they don't respect our culture and they should all go back home.
Nuke 'em.
Yeah, so you have these two main narratives that are very vocal, and I think that that is more dangerous is that because you can easily spot the right-wing prejudice, you can easily spot racism, you can easily spot, but when racism becomes more beautiful, is that, oh look, he is a victim, and therefore he became Jihadi John, and therefore he became an ISIS member, and therefore
That's
he became
racism.
Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
That is racism, but it's painted in a very beautiful way that I care about their culture, I know where they come from. If I grew up like this, I would probably be Jihadi John, and it always be painted in very, very sketchy, pseudo-liberal, postmodernist, Ivy League graduate style, and which it shows up as like, no, we're not really racist, and I'm not really like this other white guy over there who's racist. I'm like the good guy. I think that he should actually be a terrorist because we discriminated against them. And so you have this, and they're trying to feed into the victimhood complex, and I think it's very dangerous, and it's producing more and more people stuck in this victimhood mentality, and we're producing more terrorists because of this mentality.
Well, whether I wanted to be or not, Faisal seems to have painted me very strongly in the left.
I dislike you strongly, Byron. I dislike you strongly.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to have to close out the show. I want to thank everybody for your participation. It was a good one. I would like to do another show like this along these lines because, to be completely frank, I didn't get to talk about the specific stories that bothered me so much. I mean, there's so many stories we've seen recently that really have an edge to them and then need to be discussed. And I wish we could have taken part in all of that, but there's just no way to do that in a 1-hour show.
Yeah, I think your video on the Chapel Hill victims was excellent, Aaron. Like, it was completely captured everything. So,
thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the show. I will remind people that the next Raw Man podcast will be done live from Melbourne, Australia. I will be interviewing a very eccentric Catholic priest called Father Bob, and that should be interesting. That'll be in 2 weeks. I want to thank all of my guests. Mark, did you have anything to close with?
Just reminding people that we will be moving over to the private chat with our guests for our Ramen podcast supporters immediately after the show. You could sign up for that on the website. And that reminding the episode was sponsored by ReasonCon. Go to reasonnc.com and get tickets. It's the last weekend of April. A lot of good speakers in Hickory, North Carolina.
All right, thank you. We will be discussing those issues I just brought up a moment ago. We'll be discussing those in the after show. Thank you very much, and good night.